Today, don't be scared by the lion on screen. We're going to be talking about what to do in response to a similar situation. My lesson today is called Fight or Flight, but really the subtitle would be Our Response to Sin. God has really ingrained in each of us certain instincts that we would call, instincts really, that are meant to protect us. All of God's creatures are made that way, and it's usually called, this instinct would be called the fight or flight response. It's really what a living creature would be naturally inclined to do in the face of danger. Will it stay and fight that danger, or will it run away and try to live another day? Of course, humans have this instinct, just like animals do. We naturally and subconsciously kind of decide to fight or flight in the face of danger in the moment. We all have experienced times like that. It might not be in danger of our lives, but it could be on some level that we have that instinct come into play. But the typical moral preference among humans is that we fight, right? Because that's very brave. People of all times and cultures have always admired those that would stand and fight in the face of danger or adversity. There are countless stories from history that follow some brave soul that, despite being outnumbered or outgunned, will stand and fight in the face of evil. From David and Goliath to maybe the brave soldiers of World War II, humanity has always pushed itself to fight rather than to flight. Running away from danger is seen as weak and cowardly, which leads to a temptation for us to choose fight, not because it's logical or because it's the right thing for us to do, but because it shows off our moral strength or our physical strength. So this fight or flight instinct, it not only applies to physical dangers, but also to spiritual dangers. Naturally, you'd assume that God wants us to fight sin. When we're encountering sin, you'd think, okay, God wants me to fight this sin, because it's the opposite of all that is good and godly, and He wants to destroy our enemy. It's brave to want to fight sin, right? Wouldn't you think so? Well, let's see what God has to say about fight or flight. We're going to look at our main verse here, 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 14, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. 1 Timothy chapter 6, 11, but as for you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. God makes it very clear that when it comes to facing sin and temptation, He does not want us to stand and fight. He does not want us to be brave and to try to test our strength against our greatest enemy. He actually wants us to run. He wants us to get out of there, just to get away from the sin. And this is really the opposite of what humanity would think is the right choice. Remember, we're kind of trained, at least society-wise, we're trained to think that running away is cowardly and weak and always the wrong answer. Why would we want to run away from evil and allow sin to beat us, to win? So why would God Himself tell us to do that when it seems so counterintuitive? Well, the primary reason is that we are weaker than we think. Temptation is stronger than we think. The devil is a very cunning enemy, and one of his most subtle methods is tricking us into thinking that our strength is bigger than we think it is. We are overestimating our strength and underestimating the strength of sin. Now, when we're at our spiritual high point, sometimes our faith can kind of come in waves. And when we're at the top of the wave, we're at our spiritual high point, we might say, well, I wouldn't fall into that sin again. I have grown since the last time, and I'm a much stronger Christian. I can handle it if it comes upon me again. And it's easy to say that we'll overcome sin with just our willpower when we're in safety. Just like it's easy to say, I would totally win against a fight in a lion when I'm standing here in the pulpit. But we forget that the promises of sin, or the promises that sin whispers in our ear. Sin will always promise pleasure and like it will solve all your problems, but then it will hide the consequences until it's too late. And it's only after we've fallen into that sin that we see what sin truly brings us. The wise Christian knows how this works, how sin works, and also knows that Satan only really attacks us when we're weak. So let's look at some biblical examples of men who had the choice of fight or flight, and we're going to see what happened whenever they chose what they did. We're going to look first at Genesis chapter 39. This is the example of a godly man named Joseph. It's a very popular example of his, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So we're going to analyze it and just kind of see what he did here. Here in this passage, the background is that Joseph is currently working under a high-ranking Egyptian named Potiphar. And Joseph is a great worker. His master Potiphar admires him to the point of trusting him with pretty much everything. He's pretty much Potiphar's right-hand man. In fact, in Genesis chapter 39, verse 6, it says that Joseph took care of everything so much that Potiphar only had to worry about what food he ate for the day. Joseph took care of the rest. So he was a great worker, and they were very tight. But Genesis chapter 39, verses 6 through 10, shows us how Satan had left a trap for Joseph. So let's read it together. Hope that's good. Yeah, that's great. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in his house, and he's put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Joseph is showing his strength here. He's saying no to the advances of this woman time and time again, day after day. But Satan figures out a way to corner him. He changes his tactic, and he figures out a way to corner him, starting at verses 11 and 12. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. Joseph didn't say, "No, let me continue my work in another room. I won't fall to this temptation." He didn't try to talk her out of it like all the other times that he had day after day. He didn't try to test his self-control. Joseph literally ran away. He literally fled. And Joseph didn't run because he knew he was strong. Joseph ran because he knew he was weak. He knew that if he had stayed, he would have given in to that temptation. Trying to fight the temptation was a pointless battle that was lost from the start. So the only thing that he knew that would work for sure was just to get out of there, to get out of the situation. Okay, so Joseph chose flight. Now let's look at another example of fight versus flight and see what not to do. See what happens when you try to choose fighting sin. We're going to look at King David here, who made this choice in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Okay, we're going to read verses 2 through 4. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. So David here had a choice up on that roof. When he saw another man's wife in a private moment, like bathing, and he knew that lingering in that temptation would eventually get the better of him, but instead of just leaving and getting out of that situation, he hung around. He let his eyes and thoughts linger on sinful pleasure, and he tried to just rely on his willpower as the king to resist such sin. And of course, he just suddenly fell headlong into the sin, and the results of that mistake, the results of trying to fight sin, followed him the rest of his life. All because he thought he was strong enough to just sit there and resist the sin. He underestimated the power of temptation because of his pride, because his pride told him that he was strong enough. As 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12 says, "Therefore let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed, lest he fall." So we've seen that God's advice here is to flee instead of fight. And we've seen examples in the Bible of what happens if you flee and what happens if you fight. But isn't fleeing cowardly? How do we get away from that mindset that fleeing can be cowardly and that fleeing means Satan is winning? Well, to answer that, I'd like to look at how the Bible describes Satan. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says, "Be sober-minded and be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Here's a visual for us right here of how Satan, the Bible compares Satan to a roaring lion, which, as we can see here, is pretty terrifying. I think if you were faced with a lion, would you try to fight it or would you run away? We can see here that running from a danger that we have no hope of overcoming is not cowardly. In fact, in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 3, it says, "The prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it." Do people think it's cowardly to run from a lion? Do people think it's cowardly to evacuate before a hurricane hits? Or do people find someone weak for avoiding poison? This is the mindset that we have to have when we're fighting sin. Fighting sin is like fighting a lion or fighting a hurricane or fighting poison. In order to survive, we have to just run, to get away. So we've kind of established that we need to run away, and that's what God recommends that we do. But what does that look like? What does it mean to flee from sin? Does this mean that we act like Joseph every time we're tempted and just get out of there physically? Sometimes. Sometimes it does. Fleeing doesn't mean getting up physically every time, but sometimes it absolutely can be helped, just like in Joseph's situation. In the case of Joseph, moving from the environment of the empty house with just him and his master's wife to somewhere more secluded or just somewhere away from Potiphar's wife was what he had to do. And for us, that could mean leaving the room when we're presented with temptation, like an inappropriate image on TV, or someone lighting a cigarette, or someone offering a drink, or someone even having a crass joke or bad language. Sometimes the only thing that we can do in those situations is just to physically leave or flee. But fleeing is not always a physical reaction. As we can see in number 2 here, sometimes fleeing means planning avoidance in the future. In Proverbs chapter 5, the wise King Solomon is advising the reader on how to avoid an adulterous woman. He says in Proverbs 5, verses 7 and 8, "And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house." Here he's saying, you know how to get to this sin, right? We know that you know the path to get there. So keep yourself far away from that spot. Because if you get close to that spot, you will fall. You're gonna fall. Later in Proverbs, there's an example of a man who does not plan to avoid temptation, who does not plan to stay away from the path of sin ahead of time. We're going to look at Proverbs 7, and this is a longer reading, but this is 7 through 20. Let's read it together. "I have perceived among the youths," says Solomon, "a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road to her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the time of night and darkness. And behold, the woman meets him, dressed as a prostitute, wily of heart. She is loud and wayward. Her feet do not stay at home. Now in the street, now in the market, at every corner she lies in wait. She seizes him and kisses him, and with bold face she says to him, I had to offer sacrifices, and today I have paid my vows. So now I have come out to meet you, to seek you eagerly, and I have found you. I have spread my couch with coverings, colored linens from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love till morning. Let us delight ourselves with love, for my husband is not at home. He has gone on a long journey. He took a bag of money with him, and at full moon he will come home." So pausing here, we'll see the young man has wandered into a situation where the cards are pretty stacked against him. It's late. It's dark. This attractive woman appears to be all over him. Her husband isn't around and won't be around for a long time, and she even smells nice. So the cards are all stacked against him. And this young man really thinks that with all of that going on, his willpower is enough to save him. He really thinks that in that moment, he has the strength. No, Satan is in that moment whispering lies of sin in his ear. And continuing the passage, we're going to see the result in Proverbs 7, verses 21 through 23. "With much seductive speech she persuades him. With her smooth talk she compels him. All at once he follows her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as a stag is caught fast, till an arrow pierces its liver, as a bird rushes into a snare. He does not know that it will cost him his life. Fleeing from sin means avoiding situations that you know the sin will be present in. And it also means cutting off anything in your life that Satan can use to cause you to fall into sin. Look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 29 through 30. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. What this basically means is that Jesus does not expect us to cut off our hand or to start pulling out our eyeballs to make it to heaven. But what he's saying here is that you need to sacrifice, or you may need to sacrifice for purity. In this example with this picture here, if your phone causes you to sin in any way, you don't need a phone anymore. If your path home from work passes by your favorite bar or the club or something like that, then you need to take the long way home from now on. A phone or a short trip or anything else is not worth having the weakness in your life to sin. The sacrifice of a phone or a long commute home or anything like that is a very small price to pay to keep yourself from a vulnerable situation. The most important aspect, I'd say, of fleeing, though, is not running from sin, but running to God. We can see this in some of the verses that we quoted earlier. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 11. But as for you, O man of God, flee these things, pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. Flee and pursue. We must replace those sinful desires with godly pursuits. If you feel tempted, you got to flee from the situation like we've established, but you have to make sure that wherever you land from running from that situation is in prayer, in the Word, or with other Christians. Otherwise, you might just land in another trap that Satan has set for you. James chapter 4, verse 7 really assures us that when we're pursuing righteousness, we will have relief from temptation. He says, submit yourselves to the devil, or submit yourselves not to the devil, but to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. The key takeaway I want us all to have today is that the strongest Christian is not the one who stands in the face of the devil and bravely, takes on his temptation. It's the Christian who is humble enough to run to Christ when temptation appears. I think my last verse of this lesson is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. And with the temptation, He will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. Your homework from today's lesson is to think of ways that you could avoid your sin. You know your own weaknesses better than anybody else, and the areas and situations that you will be the most vulnerable. So make a plan to avoid and flee from those sins, and make a plan then to run to Christ.